The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that comes when power tries to smother truth. Alan Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth but dripping with condescension, as though every syllable he uttered was meant to belittle. "Congresswoman," he began with a thin smile, "you may be passionate, but passion isn't the same as knowledge. Leave the law to those of us who've actually practiced it." A faint ripple of murmurs ran through the room. The cameras caught it all, his smug half-grin, the slight tilt of his head as if he'd delivered a masterstroke. To the untrained eye, it looked like victory. He thought he had cornered her, reduced her to silence. He thought his reputation, his decades of airtime and courtroom fame, were enough to snuff out a rising voice. But what Dershowitz didn't realize was that the room itself was changing. Every second of his smug dismissal tightened the air, shifted the energy. People weren't just listening, they were waiting. Not for him. For her. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her gaze steady, her posture calm. She didn't fidget, didn't roll her eyes, didn't even blink more than necessary. She allowed his arrogance to hang in the air like smoke, let it fill every corner so that when she finally spoke, the contrast would strike like lightning. Because here's the truth, Dershowitz wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to every woman who has ever been told she's too emotional. He was talking to every young leader who's been told they don't belong at the table. He was talking to every immigrant, every underdog, every voice dismissed by those who cling to outdated authority. And Jasmine Crockett was about to answer, not only for herself, but for all of them. If you were watching at home, you could feel it through the screen. The hairs on your arms prickled. The room seemed to contract, every pair of eyes snapping toward her. He smirked, thinking he had won. But in that pause, in that calm before the storm, you could sense it, the balance of power was about to flip. But he had no idea what was coming. And with just a few words, she turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to step back and look at the two figures who collided in that chamber. On one side stood Alan Dershowitz, a man who had built an empire of credibility around his name. To some, he was the very definition of a legal giant, a Harvard professor, a courtroom performer whose sharp tongue had earned him a place on television screens for decades. He carried himself with the weight of someone who had argued alongside presidents, advised celebrities, and basked in the glow of elite approval. But the sheen of prestige has a shadow. With every headline and every microphone thrust in his face, Dershowitz had learned to rely on the arrogance of seniority. He believed his voice was the final word. To him, experience wasn't just a qualification, it was a weapon. And when he turned that weapon on younger leaders, he expected them to crumble, intimidated by the sheer force of his resume. Facing him was Jasmine Crockett, the kind of figure his generation never saw coming. A congresswoman from Texas who didn't fit the mold, didn't apologize for her presence, and didn't shrink under the gaze of power. Crockett's rise was not paved by elite institutions or softened by privilege. It was forged in the grind of proving herself, in the sting of being underestimated again and again, in the fire of representing communities often left voiceless. This was never just an exchange of words. It was a collision of worlds. Dershowitz embodied the old guard, entitled, insulated, cloaked in the authority of a system that had always favored men who looked like him. Crockett stood for something else entirely, a new America where voices dismissed as too young or too emotional were finally refusing to bow. The stakes could not have been clearer. If Dershowitz won this moment, the message would ripple outward, that the old rules still applied, that pedigree and bluster could silence even the fiercest challengers. But if Crockett rose above, it meant something bigger than a single debate. It meant that elitism could be dismantled with clarity, that dignity could defeat arrogance, that truth spoken calmly could carry more power than decades of practiced bluster. And make no mistake, the audience knew it. Those sitting in the chamber felt the tension like a string pulled tight. Those watching online recognized the deeper meaning instantly. This was not a squabble over policy. It was the story of America itself, told through the clash of two very different voices. On one side, a man clinging to the fading aura of authority. On the other, a woman who had every reason to be counted out, refusing to let her light be dimmed. The symbolic stakes were enormous. Every pause, every glance, every breath of that confrontation was loaded with history, centuries of hierarchy, prejudice, and dismissal on one side, and the relentless push for dignity and representation on the other. And in that silence before Crockett's reply, the choice was clear: America could keep bowing to the arrogance of entitlement, or it could rise with the voices demanding respect. But the deeper you look into Dershowitz's playbook, the more his cracks begin to show. For decades, Alan Dershowitz has carried himself like a man untouchable. His name was stamped into the annals of American law as if it were carved in stone. He was the youngest full professor in Harvard Law School's history, a man whose students filled courtrooms and boardrooms around the country. He argued landmark cases, defended the powerful, and strutted across cable news like a general surveying the battlefield. To millions, he was the legal oracle, brash, brilliant, unafraid to stir outrage in the pursuit of his cause. But brilliance and arrogance often walk hand in hand. With every appearance on television, with every book, with every microphone that tilted toward his lips, Dershowitz grew accustomed to being the smartest man in the room. His sentences were delivered with finality, as though dissent was beneath him. He cultivated an image of being bold, unapologetic, even fearless. And yet, beneath that cultivated exterior, contradictions swirled. For all his boasts of standing for truth and justice, his choices often told another story. Time and again, Dershowitz attached his name to the defense of men whose reputations were tainted, if not outright poisoned. He became known not just for his courtroom skill, but for his willingness to stand beside figures accused of corruption, violence, or worse. His explanations were always wrapped in the language of principle. Everyone deserves a defense, he would say, but the effect was unmistakable. To the public, he began to look less like a guardian of law and more like a mercenary of prestige, a man who measured his worth by the spotlight he commanded. And then came the tone-deaf pronouncements, the sound bites that revealed just how insulated he had become. In debates, he would dismiss challengers with a sneer. On panels, he spoke with a certainty that left no oxygen for opposing views. On social issues, his words often landed with the bluntness of someone who had not bothered to listen, who had long ago stopped believing that younger, sharper voices had anything to teach him. That was his blind spot. Because the very world he once dominated was changing. The days when legal titans and old-guard commentators could speak unchallenged were fading. A new generation had arrived, more diverse, more impatient with arrogance, more willing to call out hypocrisy in real time. Social media had become the great equalizer, and every smirk, every condescending phrase, every attempt to shut someone down was captured, clipped, and shared to millions. The tools that had once amplified his authority now threatened to expose his hubris. And still, Dershowitz pressed on as if nothing had changed. He doubled down on his persona, leaning on his titles, his history, his brand of intellectual swagger. To him, experience was a shield. To him, pedigree was proof. To him, anyone who challenged him, especially a woman younger than his own students, was an obstacle to be swatted away. That overconfidence blinded him. It made him miss the shift in the air when Jasmine Crockett looked him in the eye. It kept him from noticing that his words no longer silenced, they ignited. It convinced him that his dismissive jab would end the debate before it truly began. But arrogance has a way of setting the stage for downfall. In every story, the villain's greatest weakness is not lack of strength, but an excess of pride. Dershowitz had spent decades speaking over others, commanding deference, and expecting submission. What he failed to see was that the ground beneath him had shifted, and the old script no longer worked. And that overconfidence would be his undoing the moment Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin under the soft glow of elite universities or within the insulated halls of privilege. It begins in Texas, where grit and resilience are not abstract ideas but daily necessities. From an early age, she understood what it meant to be underestimated, to walk into rooms where people judged her before she ever spoke, to carry the weight of stereotypes that sought to define her before she had the chance to define herself. She grew up in a world where doors did not swing open automatically. If she wanted a path forward, she would have to carve it with her own hands. And so she did. Crockett chose the law not because it was glamorous, not because it promised prestige, but because it was a weapon for justice. She became a public defender, representing those who had no one else in their corner, standing beside people society was ready to forget. In cramped courtrooms, she sharpened her voice, learning to dismantle arrogance with facts, to pierce through bluster with clarity. Every case was a battle, not just for her clients but for the principle that dignity should never depend on wealth or status. It was in those early fights that she developed the poise we now see on the national stage, the ability to stay calm while others tried to shout her down, the confidence to keep speaking truth even when the room bristled against it. But the challenges didn't stop at the courtroom doors. As a black woman in politics, Crockett was forced to carry more than her share of skepticism. She was told she was too young, too fiery, too emotional. Her intelligence was questioned, her motives dismissed. Each step forward was shadowed by whispers that she didn't belong. And yet, each attempt to diminish her only fueled her determination. She refused to shrink, refused to apologize for her presence, refused to dilute her fire to make others comfortable. Crockett understood something essential: representation was not about fitting into the old mold, it was about breaking it open so others could walk through. Her rise to Congress was not an accident, nor was it a gift. It was earned through relentless persistence, through knocking on doors and refusing to let voters be ignored, through challenging entrenched interests who had grown too comfortable. She brought with her not the polish of someone groomed by institutions, but the authenticity of someone who had walked the same streets, endured the same struggles, and carried the same hopes as the people she represented. And once she arrived in Washington, she carried that fire with her. Crockett quickly became known not just as a congresswoman, but as a force. She was unafraid to speak when silence was expected. She was unapologetic about demanding accountability when others tried to look away. Her speeches were not rehearsed performances, they were lived experiences poured into words. For her supporters, Crockett symbolized something bigger than one district in Texas. She was proof that a new generation of leaders could no longer be sidelined. She was the answer to those who doubted whether politics could truly represent the full spectrum of America's identity. She was the embodiment of resilience, of dignity refusing to bow to arrogance, of courage in the face of centuries of dismissal. And that is why the moment she sat across from Alan Dershowitz mattered so much. Because when he looked at her, he saw only the surface: a young congresswoman, a woman of color, someone he assumed could be boxed in with a patronizing comment. What he failed to see was the journey behind her gaze, the years of battle that had forged her calm. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another face in Congress. She was a woman who had been doubted at every turn, and yet every doubt became fuel. She was a leader who had stood firm against dismissals before, who had endured the stereotypes, the raised eyebrows, the dismissive tones, and had emerged sharper, stronger, and more resolute. So when Dershowitz leaned back with his smug smile, certain that his words had ended the debate, he didn't realize the weight of what sat across from him. He didn't realize he was speaking to someone who had faced down far harsher dismissals and walked away victorious. Which is exactly why, when the spotlight hit her, she didn't just respond, she commanded the moment. The smirk hadn't left his face. Dershowitz leaned forward this time, his voice thick with authority, his cadence rehearsed from years of courtroom theatrics. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, drawing out the title as if it were a sarcastic compliment, "you may speak with conviction, but conviction without comprehension is dangerous. The law is not a stage for speeches. It's a discipline, a science, one I've spent my entire life mastering. And frankly, I'd advise you to be cautious before you embarrass yourself further." The words dropped into the chamber like lead. He paused after the last phrase, as though waiting for the weight of his authority to press her into submission. A few heads nodded, habitual deference to a man who had once been seen as untouchable. To those who had followed his career, the performance was familiar, the careful condescension, the practiced lowering of the opponent's stature, the air of inevitability. But this wasn't a courtroom from the 1980s. It was 2025, and millions were watching. Cameras panned, catching the flicker of discomfort across the audience. Some in the chamber shifted uneasily, sensing the imbalance of power. Online, live-stream chats filled with emojis of disbelief, viewers hammering their keyboards in real time. Did he just say that? Wow, the arrogance. Wait for her response. And there she sat, Jasmine Crockett, unshaken. She didn't flinch, didn't move to interrupt, didn't allow even the smallest crack in her composure. Instead, she studied him as though his words were nothing more than background noise, as though his superiority routine had already expired. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was power. It was the patience of someone who had heard this kind of dismissal her entire life, who had learned that silence, at the right moment, could be sharper than any rebuttal. Dershowitz mistook it for retreat. Emboldened, he pressed harder. His voice rose a notch, the theatricality swelling. He invoked history, precedent, Latin phrases meant to remind the audience of his pedigree. I've stood in the highest courts of this nation, he boomed, argued before justices, advised presidents. And you think you can lecture me on the law? His laughter was thin, forced, the kind of chuckle meant to belittle, not amuse. The imbalance was palpable. On one side, a man leaning on the crutch of reputation, puffing himself up with every sentence. On the other, a woman who remained perfectly composed, waiting, letting him spin his web tighter, giving him all the rope he needed. The chamber itself seemed to sense it. Every rustle quieted. Every whisper stopped. The tension built, second by second, like the rising pressure before a storm breaks. Even through the television screen, viewers could feel it, the gap between arrogance and dignity widening with every breath he took. And still, Crockett said nothing. This was no accident. She understood the power of timing, the electricity of anticipation. She knew that patience could be as devastating as interruption. So she let him talk, let him expose himself with every smug phrase, every outdated jab, every note of superiority that rang more hollow than the last. By the time he finished, his words were no longer echoing authority. They were echoing desperation, the brittle sound of a man trying to hold on to a pedestal that was already crumbling. And then, silence. Everyone waited to see how she would respond. For a moment, the air held its breath. Dershowitz's final words still lingered in the chamber, heavy with the smugness of someone convinced he had the last say. His smirk hovered, almost daring her to answer, expecting her to shrink beneath the mountain of his reputation. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, her voice low at first but deliberate, each word slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "Professor," she began, her tone neither hostile nor deferential, but measured. "You've had decades to rehearse that speech. You've had decades of cameras, headlines, and opportunities to remind everyone of your resume. And yet, with all that experience, you still seem to confuse arrogance with authority." A ripple moved through the chamber, an audible shift of energy. He straightened in his chair, blinking once, not expecting the directness. She continued, her voice steady, each sentence building momentum. "You think I don't understand the law because I don't carry your titles, because I didn't sit in the same ivy-covered classrooms as you? Let me be clear, the law is not your trophy. It is not your inheritance. It is not the property of men who believe their pedigree gives them ownership of justice." The audience stilled. Every eye was fixed on her, every camera zoomed in. Online, comment threads lit up in real time. "She said what? This is history. I've got chills. And while you sit here cataloging your achievements like they are shields against criticism, some of us have actually lived the consequences of broken systems. Some of us became lawyers not for prestige but for survival, for the people who never get invited into the rooms where you boast about your accomplishments. Those people deserve representation, too. And that's exactly why I'm here." The cadence rose. Her words now carried the rhythm of inevitability, a calm storm gathering force. Dershowitz shifted, his smirk faltering for the first time, the mask of condescension slipping just enough to betray discomfort. You say passion without comprehension is dangerous. But let me tell you what's truly dangerous: knowledge without compassion. Law without humanity. Decades of power without accountability. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of people turning to one another. She didn't let it slow her. You've built a career defending men who thought their power made them untouchable. Men who believed rules didn't apply to them. And now here you sit, repeating the same mistake, underestimating someone who refuses to bow just because you demand it. You've confused condescension for wisdom. And the whole world can see the difference. At that, the cameras caught it, the flicker of irritation crossing his face, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but she didn't give him the space. You can list every courtroom you've walked into. You can remind us of every president you've whispered to behind closed doors. But here's the truth: the era of unchecked arrogance is ending. And your words today prove exactly why. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't theatrical. It was delivered with the calm force of someone who knew her truth was stronger than his reputation. That contrast, the dignity in her delivery versus the bluster in his, was the exact cinematic reversal the moment demanded. Reaction shots told the rest of the story: the stunned stillness of committee members, the widened eyes of staffers, the slow head shakes of disbelief from those who realized they were witnessing history in real time. Online, the clip had already been clipped, captioned, shared: knowledge without compassion is dangerous. The law is not your inheritance. Hashtag spread like wildfire, hashtag Crockett clapback, and hashtag dignity over arrogance. Dershowitz, once the master of the room, now sat visibly rattled. He fumbled with his papers, cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the dominance that had evaporated in seconds. But it was too late. The performance he thought would humiliate her had instead exposed him. And Crockett knew it. She didn't gloat, didn't need to. She let the silence after her words do the work. Because the most devastating takedowns aren't followed by triumphal shouting, they're followed by a silence so heavy it tells the world who truly won. When she leaned back, her gaze never leaving his, the message was unmistakable. She hadn't just defended herself. She had dismantled him. The chamber erupted, not with chaos, but with the quiet awe of people realizing they had just seen a moment that would live far beyond those walls. But what happened after she finished speaking made the entire internet explode. It took less than an hour. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's clapback hit the internet like a lightning strike, and the digital sky lit up with fire. Within minutes, Twitter's trending page was dominated by one phrase: hashtag Crockett clapback. By the end of the day, millions had seen it, reshared it, stitched it, and turned it into the kind of cultural moment that no spin doctor or publicist could ever manufacture. On TikTok, creators moved fast. Some laid dramatic music under her words, Hans Zimmer crescendos paired with the line, knowledge without compassion is dangerous. Others looped the moment Dershowitz's smirk faltered, slowing it down, zooming in, and pairing it with captions like, the exact second arrogance lost. One viral edit froze on Crockett's calm stare, text flashing across the screen, the law is not your inheritance. The audio became a soundbite, repurposed into thousands of clips, students mouthing along, activists using it over montages, even comedians parodying Dershowitz's stunned expression. Twitter threads read like battle hymns. Commentators from across the progressive spectrum declared at the moment elitism had finally been checked in real time. Journalists clipped her lines with headlines like, Crockett's calm dismantling of Dershowitz reverberates across social media. Activists reposted it with captions celebrating the shift in tone, this is what representation looks like. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. Within hours, monologues were being drafted around Dershowitz's deflation and Crockett's unshakable poise. But perhaps the most telling ripple effect came from ordinary viewers. Young people who rarely tuned into congressional hearings found themselves quoting her in group chats. Immigrants, women, and communities long dismissed by political elites wrote posts about feeling seen, about hearing their own experiences distilled into her words. Facebook feeds flooded with captions like, "She said what we've all been wanting to say." Instagram stories carried still shots of her at the table, calm and commanding, with text overlays, "Dignity is power." Of course, defenders of Dershowitz tried to rally. A few op-eds framed Crockett's response as disrespectful or unprofessional, an attempt to paint her composure as insolence. His allies insisted she was grandstanding, that she lacked the gravitas of his experience. But those arguments fell flat against the raw footage circulating online. Every replay of his condescension followed by her dismantling only reinforced the truth: the old guard had been exposed, and no editorial spin could put the genie back in the bottle. What made it viral wasn't just the takedown itself, but the symbolism it carried. The clash wasn't one woman against one man, it was dignity against arrogance, representation against elitism, truth against bluster. And when the internet chooses sides in that kind of battle, it chooses decisively. Memes crystallized the verdict. Side-by-side images showed Dershowitz in mid-smirk next to Crockett delivering her line, with captions like, "Confidence versus competence." Animated GIFs looped the exact second his expression cracked, with text overlay, "Realizing you just lost the room." Even celebrities chimed in, from musicians to actors, applauding her words as not just a clapback, but a cultural reset. The sheer velocity of the moment was undeniable. What began as a tense exchange in a chamber now pulsed across every platform, every feed, every conversation. It wasn't just watched, it was experienced, dissected, celebrated, and shared until it became more than a clip. It became a phenomenon. It resonated because it touched something deeper in the American psyche, the yearning to see dignity rise above arrogance, to witness calm conviction outshine bluster, to believe that truth still has the power to silence condescension. For decades, moments like these rarely belonged to voices like hers. The spotlight, the platform, the microphone, they were almost always handed to the same kinds of men who believed authority came not from what you said but from who you were born to be. And in that sense, Crockett's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a declaration that the stage no longer belongs exclusively to the old guard. That voices once dismissed as too young, too fiery, or too emotional, can now command the room with composure, clarity, and courage. This was dignity winning in real time. Not the kind of dignity that sits quietly in the corner, hoping to be recognized, but the kind that stands firm and refuses to be erased. It was a reminder that strength doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers with precision, slicing through arrogance until only truth remains. Generations watching from home felt it. Older viewers who had spent their lives watching the same cycle of arrogance replayed again and again recognized the break in the pattern. Younger viewers saw proof that they, too, could stand their ground without apology. Immigrants and marginalized communities felt the validation of seeing one of their own refuse to be talked over, refuse to be reduced, refuse to bow. The beauty of that moment was its simplicity. Crockett didn't outshout him. She didn't need to. She embodied the idea that composure itself can be revolutionary, that dignity is not passive but powerful, and that the most devastating counterpunches come not from rage but from truth delivered with precision. And so the meaning stretched beyond the chamber walls. It wasn't just Crockett versus Dershowitz. It was the clash of two Americas, one clinging to entitlement, the other rising with representation. One insulated by prestige, the other sharpened by struggle. And on that day, the latter won. This is why people couldn't stop sharing it. Not because it was entertaining, though it was, but because it was affirming. It was proof that arrogance could be toppled, that elitism could be unmasked, that calm dignity could carry a thunderous impact. Because this wasn't just one viral moment, it was a glimpse into the future of American politics. Alan Dershowitz tried to outwit Jasmine Crockett, but what the world witnessed was something far greater than a clash of words. It was a revelation. In that single exchange, she showed that arrogance is not invincible, that pedigree cannot silence dignity, and that truth, when spoken with calm conviction, carries more weight than decades of bluster. Her triumph was not just personal. It was symbolic. Every line she delivered, every moment she held her ground, echoed far beyond the chamber. It told the millions watching that their own voices, too, matter. That they do not have to bow to titles or shrink beneath the shadow of old authority. That in the face of condescension, dignity can not only survive, it can win. And this is where you come in. Because what Crockett did in that moment is not meant to be a story locked in a single clip. It's meant to be a spark, one that spreads every time someone shares it, every time someone remembers that arrogance doesn't get the final word. So if this moment moved you, if you felt the power of dignity prevailing against dismissal, don't let it stop here. Subscribe, share, and be part of the growing community that refuses to be silenced. Every share keeps the message alive. Every comment adds to the chorus of voices saying, dignity is stronger than arrogance, representation is stronger than elitism, and the future belongs to those who stand unshaken. Alan Dershowitz underestimated Jasmine Crockett. The world will not make that mistake again.